Canon Hinnant is a name we should all know. Canon Hinnant is a name the media should have been full of for weeks. And if Canon Hinnant had been black, I'm sure the world would have heard his name and the media wouldn't be able to stop talking about him. But Canon Hinnant was white. He was a 5-year-old white boy who was riding his bike around his front garden as his two sisters played beside him, when his 25-year-old black neighbour, Darius Sessoms, shot him dead. Sessoms walked up to him and shot him in the head at point-blank range. Canon Hinnant was executed in broad daylight as he played in his own front yard. Yet despite the horrific nature of this crime, despite the fact it involved a firearm, and despite there being a racial aspect to the murder, the press was very hesitant to talk about it. In fact, despite the American media having everything in this one story that they would usually jump all over, violence, the use of a firearm, and the fact the crime was interracial, the American media didn't seem to want to touch the story. Quite simply, this was because Canon Hinnant was white and his killer was black. So this story was largely ignored, and when it was covered, the commentary was markedly different to what you might expect. Forbes ran with the following headline, and I quote, "How the murder of 5-year-old Canon Hinnant became a conservative controversy about race." End quote. This article opines that conservatives are somehow doing the unthinkable by talking about the racial aspect of this case. The irony of this headline was not lost on me, as the entire Western media talks about race every single day and goes to great lengths to cover any story involving a person of colour who perceives that they have been wronged in any way by a white person. Yet to these same journalists, in the case of Canon Hinnant, the idea of talking about race is unthinkable. Snopes, the fact-checking site, which doesn't check facts at all, but instead reinforces the anti-white agenda pushed by the media, was quick to say that any talk of a media conspiracy to cover up this story was in fact a conspiracy theory itself. Several other small news outlets seemed more concerned about fake news surrounding the case being spread on Facebook and other social networks than they were about the murder itself. This again seemed rather hypocritical, as for months every major news outlet has been spreading fake news about the death of George Floyd, a man who died after resisting arrest and was found to have ingested a lethal dose of fentanyl, yet despite this, many media outlets referred to his death as murder. And this brings us to the point of all of this. The mainstream media love a story with a racial angle. They love a story where a black person, or someone else who isn't of European descent, suffers at the hands of a white person or is the victim of some perceived racial injustice. A week ago, the British press were quick to cover the story of a black woman who was offended that a British retailer described a piece of underwear as tobacco-coloured. The retailer was forced to apologise. This is a case where one black woman perceives something completely innocuous as racist and the press jumps on the issue. A retailer is forced to apologise and white people are given another lesson in racism. Yet a 5-year-old white boy is executed in his front garden by a black man and no one wants to talk about it. And if they do speak about it, race is not mentioned. At this point it is clear to see that despite what Snopes says, the media does conspire to push an anti-white agenda. And that is clearly illustrated by the fact that the world's media spent months mourning the death of a violent black criminal who died whilst being arrested, yet has barely mentioned the case of Canon Hinnant. But the media is not just guilty of ignoring the Canon Hinnant case. They are also guilty of spreading the kind of anti-white hatred that leads to anti-white attacks and even the murder of white people. The same media outlets that have ignored Canon Hinnant's murder are always so happy to run with anti-white narratives and fall over themselves to push any story that paints white people as evil. The media have not only ignored Canon Hinnant's murder, but it is likely that their narrative contributed to his death. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help spread the message by liking and sharing it on social networks. If you want to hear more from me,